welcome to one of our employability videos for the law school. This video I'm joined by Hollie Gilbery, who's a barrister, and Hollie and I are going to discuss a career at the bar. Hi Hollie.
Hello.
To start us off, could you introduce who you are and what your role is?
Well, my name is Hollie Gilbery. I am a barrister at KBG Chambers here in Plymouth. I mainly specialise in crime and mental health, and I've been a barrister now for just over 3 years.
Thanks. And what can you tell us about KBG Chambers?
So we're mainly based in Plymouth. We're a chambers of over 40 people now, specialising in family, crime and civil. We also have offices and bases in Truro and Exeter. We cover all the main areas of work as well as some more niche practices throughout the southwest and beyond, really.
And what are the kind of core responsibilities in your role?
In my role, in the criminal side of my work, either prosecuting a case, and that can involve anything from initial advice once the case has reached the court stage, if I think there's things lacking in evidence or concerns about getting the matter through trial, through to any hearings in the trial itself, should it proceed that way. If I'm defending, much the same, just on the other foot, meeting with clients nice and early, advising them on everything really that can come up in their case, whether that's likely sentence, what steps they should take, whether they should have a trial, and everything in between. And obviously after that process, whether there's an appeal, whether there are matters of law that need to be dealt with. So mainly court work in the criminal sector, but some advisory work, written and oral advice as well.
There's quite a lot of skills you're engaging with, quite a diverse workload to balance, and lots of client care as well.
Yes.
What does a typical week look like for you when you look at your diary for a week and you come in?
If you've got a trial that lasts either the week or a few days, you're going to be in court all day for those days. And obviously there'll be a lot of liaising with witnesses, liaising with your client. And that can be quite full on, and of course you've got to go home at the end of a full court day, still prepare anything you've got left in that trial for the following day. You might also have emails asking you for answers to questions on other cases. So it's certainly not a 9 to 5 job. In quieter weeks, or what might look like a quieter week in your diary, it might look like you're only going to be in court for 15 minutes or an hour out of the day, but you can still spend the rest of the working day advising on other matters, chasing up other things, doing your accounts, or all that sort of thing.
Right. So now we've had an overview of the role and what you do, we'll come back to that slightly later. What I would really like to do and share with students is your career development. So if we can start with the basics, why did you choose the legal profession and specifically the role of a barrister?
In terms of the legal profession itself, it was just something that always interested me from a young age. I've never actually necessarily been able to give a definitive answer to that, that there is the sort of old cliche of just feeling like you are able to help people. I liked the idea of being able to stand up and argue a point, or argue and deal with things, put things to witnesses. And the reason I think I prefer the bar route to the LPC solicitor route and the other routes at Silex and so on now. For me personally, I liked the control I had over my own future and career progression that you get at the self-employed bar. And
it's such a diverse sector, isn't it? And you can really become specialist in a certain area.
Yes.
Which may be different to maybe being a solicitor, where it might be the needs of the firm drive
Yes.
your workload.
Yes.
For you in particular, you mentioned crime and mental health specialisms. What attracted you to those in particular?
I think crime, just again because it was something that interested me from such a young age, it's criminal law that perhaps most people know about more than, certainly earlier than others. Again, that interaction with people from all walks of life, the most vulnerable members of society can find themselves in the courts either as a witness or as a defendant. The advocacy, the sort of that side of the job appeals more, and that's something you get more in crime than perhaps in the other sectors. As far as mental health, that was something that I came to a bit later. During my first sixth of pupillage, my pupil supervisor did a lot of mental health tribunals that I watched, and so even at that late stage it was nice to think, here's another area I was unfamiliar with, and as you say, you have that control to look at other areas, and that was where the interest came for me in that latter stage.
and actually they're not unrelated.
No, not overlap.
Have you seen a change? There's been a change almost in the PR of mental health in the last sort of 2 to 3, 4 years. Have you seen that benefit the profession in a wider understanding of mental health and behaviours and support that might be needed, or do you still feel that there's quite a long way to go in terms of it being taken into account or being a protected kind of characteristic?
I think certainly in the criminal sector and in criminal proceedings, much more so. In fact, Plymouth has been one of the trial court centres for looking at mental health treatment requirements as part of community sentences. So if that is something that is strongly linked to someone's offending, and they're perhaps struggling to get the help that they need from their GP, or we're on great big long waiting lists, there are limited resources, it's perhaps a way of looking at it to stop further offending in the future. So yes, I think there has, even in as recently in the past 12 months, been quite a change.
That's great. So what do you see as the greatest barriers or to your role? What's the greatest challenges do you think you face in your role on a day-to-day basis?
Meeting with people with mental health, you sort of come into a profession in the law or career in the law, you think you need to know the law, but in actual fact, of course you do, but more and more you need to know how to handle people, and you are there often on your own or just yourself and your instructing solicitor, and you can interacting with people with all sorts of mental health difficulties, and you need to know how to deal with that, and of course some people are better suited to that than others. There's no training manual for it, and certainly not as part of any of your legal training. We all know that funding is being cut across the board in crime and in mental health, which of course most impacts me. So it's getting the work can be quite a barrier to career progression as well. If you dig your heels in and find your superpower within the job, you can carry on.
Great. On the flip side, what are the greatest successes that you have in your role?
What I like about the bar, and again, this is what probably drew me to that more so than others, it's the mini successes. So having completed all the training, your first sixth as part of your training, then finally getting work in on your own in your second sixth, that first brief that's got your name on as opposed to a generic piece of work that's coming into chambers, getting a solicitor that you have that working relationship with, who you might be their go-to when they need advice. So there's those little successes. Then there's again dealing with vulnerable people and feeling like you actually might have got them a bit of a result, whether that's in a sentence, whether it's in a trial. You're not going to win every hearing you step into, but if you're doing a plea mitigation and looking at a sentence for somebody who is quite vulnerable, sometimes the power of what you are able to say on their behalf that they'd never be able to articulate themselves can really make, whether it's a judge or a magistrate or whoever your tribunal may be, take a step back and see it as something that's not just perhaps a not very nice crime on the papers, but something that involves people on both sides of the offence.
And that, I think it's really important actually for students in general, but what you were talking about in a challenging profession is to really recognise the small successes, because they really build up to a picture of where you're making a difference, rather than just counting those big wins. And I think it's really important for well-being as well, actually, to reflect on all the small things that you do and all the thank yous, and yeah, I think that's really important. In both your successes and barriers, you talked about qualities really, which is people management or rapport and compassion and empathy, as well as you talked about superpower in the role, so that digging your heels in and resilience.
Yes.
With that in mind, what do you think the core qualities of a barrister are that a student might be able to develop across their university time?
Your people skills are going to be key.
Yeah.
You are nearly always going to be dealing with people, whether that's because you do an area of law like crime or mental health where you are literally dealing with people and their lives, but perhaps in a more cynical fashion, you are looking for work. You're going to get that work from people, and so you need to be able to have that rapport with your instructing solicitor, or with public access now, with the members of the public, you need to be able to have that. Similarly, advocacy is the art of persuasion, so even the manner in which you address a judge or your tribunal, and it all comes down to people skills. So that is a huge one that perhaps isn't as obvious as it should be when you're considering a career in law. If you do decide to go down the self-employed bar route or self-employed in either capacity, you need that determination and that self-motivation, that self-drive to find work, keep work, retain the work and develop your own career.
Yeah, and I think that piece around commercial awareness is really important, that you can be an expert in the law, but it is about the business, the people, the networks, and not forgetting who your client base is, and really kind of seeking opportunities. So I think that commercial awareness piece is becoming more and more important for all jobs, but particularly where you're self-employed, of course.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and where you're self-employed, you can spend an awful lot of time marketing, and it might not be in the sort of traditional commercial sense, but you might be going to dinners, or it might just be a case of making sure you phone your solicitor immediately after a hearing to keep them in the loop. But you can spend a lot of what could or should be your free time doing those things. So there are sacrifices and commitments you need to make to progress, really.
Yeah. And that's really good to know going in early, I think, so that it's not a shock later on. If we could talk about training and development, that would be really useful for people really early on in their career. So what was your training? What kind of route did you take into the role?
I took quite an untraditional route.
Right.
Completed my GCSEs and A-levels in the normal form, but at the end of that I still couldn't answer the question as to why I wanted to go into the law, so I thought, well, rather than trying to write a personal statement and apply to universities, potentially commit to the expense that a degree and everything is, I'd get some experience in a law firm, which I did in Exeter. I really enjoyed it. I knew it was where I wanted to go, but that year turned into several. And essentially, long story short, I worked for a firm of solicitors. I then worked in a barrister's chambers as a clerk, and in the meantime I did my degree part-time, distance learning in actual fact, and my bar professional training course part-time, all whilst working full-time in the legal sector.
Wow. So you were really committed and just knew it was for you. And did that help drive forward?
Hugely, yes.
Because we often have students that will study part-time for their LPC or BPTC because of managing family life or financially,
Yes.
and it's becoming more and more common. So to hear that it's absolutely possible.
Yes.
And also, though, in terms of career development, actually for an employer to see that you were so committed actually probably really helps in the long term.
Yes, and it's amazing the transferable skills you pick up, down to little things like I was saying earlier. As a barrister, your life isn't 9 till 5.
Yeah.
You might spend the day in court and still have to go home and do a lot of work. I'd already developed those skills, or the ability to work long hours, having worked full time and studied on top of that. So
you're almost accelerating the reality of what the job will be. It's not, rather than it being a cliff edge, which I think is really important. So thank you for sharing that. Whilst you were studying, you were working full time. Did you get involved in any of the societies, so like the Law Society or the Junior Law Division or the equivalent for the bar, or any kind of networking that you found important on top of the work and study?
I didn't through my degree, only because my degree was distance. It was based in Nottingham. It wasn't something that was sensibly available as a distance learning student. Of course, I was entitled to access it, but the geography meant it wasn't possible. However, because of my job in a chambers in Plymouth, I kind of had access to those things from that route. So yes, I think it is important to start building those networking routes and mooting competitions and all those sorts of things. I didn't have access to that, but in a university where I've seen it, it is hugely beneficial. It's developing those key skills early on in a relatively safe, very safe environment in a university setting.
And just getting used to that networking piece, I think, is important, because it does eventually just become a skill, but it does take a little while to get into it. So putting yourself out there, even if you think you're not that confident with it, I think can really help.
Yes.
The route to becoming a barrister can feel cost prohibitive, socially prohibitive sometimes, depending on what your networks and connections already are or where you study. So what advice would you give to somebody who is really passionate and wants to do it, but almost feels the weight of those barriers?
You can't undermine it and say, just crack on. It is a big thing and it is expensive, and there is no guarantee of pupillage or a training contract at the end, and you have to decide whether you want to take that gamble. But the only thing I'd say is, might sound flippant, but where there is a will, there is a way. If you really want to do it and you're passionate about it, you will get what you want in the end if you just keep persevering. And that might mean, to make it worth your while, go for the best grades you can possibly get from it every ounce that's available. A lot of the universities locally are fantastic for offering those opportunities, the links with local chambers, the links with local firms, the mooting competitions, the advocacy competitions. Get involved in it, bleed the system dry as it were, to get all of that experience from it, and you will get where you want to go.
And get advice, I think. So just talk to people about what they do. It's not all about, how can I get work experience? No. But just hearing from people like yourself who are in the sector about those little hidden knockbacks or successes that will kind of make it worth it. I think hearing from many people as you can really help.
Hugely.
So just to finish, I'd like to talk a bit more about that commercial awareness piece, which is, I think, staying up to date with sector issues can be really important.
Yes.
What do you see as the biggest factors affecting the legal profession that students could be aware of?
You can't read a paper at the moment without there being some criticism of particularly criminal lawyers. There's been some very high profile cases recently. There's huge actions being taken at the moment about costs to fees or cuts to fees. That is huge, and stay on top of those issues because it may well determine which area that you want to work in. I knew I wanted to work in crime, and if that meant that at times I wasn't going to live the big lifestyle, that was what I was prepared to do, because I'd rather do something I enjoy. But if that's not an option, we've all got bills to pay, you might need to think about other things. But also, more importantly, rather than looking at it, and you will go to mini pupilages, you will go to work experiences, and people will try and say to you, don't do crime, don't do crime. If you want to do crime or these other areas that are having difficulties with funding, take action, get involved. This is an area that there is always going to have to be a criminal justice system. And if you want it to be one that we can remain proud of, but more importantly, earn a living from, being realistic, get involved, do what you can to drive that awareness, whether it's sharing a tweet from the secret barrister or those sorts of blogs and things online. Just do something to raise awareness in a more positive way and be socially, commercially aware of what is going on, and perhaps just factor that in your decision making in terms of knowing that you're going to need to keep some extra money back here and there where you can.
Yeah. And you talked about the secret barrister there. Are there any particular publications or sites that you keep up with that might be good for people to, if they're looking to start that?
Absolutely. I mean, just keeping on top of the news is of course useful, and that can be done at no expense online now. There are resources we use as professionals that incur a cost that I don't think a student would necessarily need to incur. But websites like Legal Cheek, the Student Lawyer are great, and actually the Student Lawyer was one I used a lot through my degree and my bar course.
Great.
And they break it down in quite a manageable fashion.
I think the quality of some of the news sources online now, and things like Chamber Student and the Law Society Gazette, etc., they're really, become a good independent source, and I think you can't really think about any sector without understanding the news and the changes, because it's likely an interview, at least you're going to get asked about those things. And it helps build trust with your client, I think.
Hugely. And another thing you can do as a student, if there's an area of law you want to get into, particularly if it's quite a niche one, do your research, find barristers all over the country who do that area that you want to specialise in, and follow them on Twitter if they have an open account, because I think it's 5 Essex Court are really good for tweeting about pupillage application processes and guidance on that and things like that. So it's not necessarily just your publications and your websites. Look at things like Twitter, LinkedIn, because all sorts of resources are available on there as well.
Great. So to close, if there's a student listening or watching this or sat in a lecture theatre and they're thinking, I really want to do this, can I do it? What would be your kind of final bit of advice?
Just go for it, because it really is the best job in the world.
Great.
So do it.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Hollie. That's the end of our interview with Hollie, but you can watch lots of other videos on the Law School YouTube channel.